We continue discussing Thomas Sowell's Social Justice Fallacies. This is the third part of the interpretation, focusing on how Sowell criticizes intellectuals. Confucius said, "The virtue of a gentleman is like the wind, and the virtue of a petty person is like the grass." Ordinary people, limited in their cognitive level, tend to follow the prevailing winds without full responsibility. Politicians, being more rational, act to consolidate power by any means necessary, disregarding rational arguments. Therefore, when it comes to social justice issues, those who genuinely want to influence and indeed have influence are primarily intellectuals. In 2010, Sowell published a book called Intellectuals and Society, where he provided an interesting definition of intellectuals. Having knowledge alone doesn't make one an intellectual. A highly skilled doctor is a professional, and a scientist publishing numerous academic papers is a technologist. According to Sowell, intellectuals are those who have an influential impact on public thought, especially those who primarily rely on communication skills for their livelihood, such as writers, journalists, and professors. The nature of this work determines that intellectuals can speak freely without being responsible for the consequences of their decisions. On one hand, intellectuals are considered the conscience of society. However, on the other hand, precisely because they are not accountable, intellectuals often hold more radical views on social change and propose somewhat naive suggestions. Sowell criticizes precisely this aspect. To be a bit more cynical, the means of livelihood for intellectuals is to provide emotional value to people. They do not genuinely care about making mistakes. Sowell presents two particularly cool examples in Social Justice Fallacies, which I believe everyone should remember and occasionally revisit. See if it resonates with you. One example is the issue of income inequality. It's well known that over the past few decades, income inequality in the United States has been growing. All mainstream media criticize this phenomenon, and numerous scholars and politicians discuss this problem. But, in reality, it is a pseudo-problem. The standard method for measuring income inequality is to look at the Gini coefficient, and a more intuitive approach is to examine how much wealth a few rich people take from the entire society. For instance, in the past, the top 10% of income earners in the US took 1/3 of the total income, and now they take over half. Obviously, the rich are getting richer, and income inequality is widening. Although the specific figures change every year, the majority of intellectuals, including the French economist Thomas Piketty, author of Capital in the 21st Century, calculate it this way. However, Sowell says that calculating it this way is wrong. The total income distribution in society is a cross-sectional data. It can only tell you how much income each person received in that year, but cannot examine the income situation of each person throughout their lifetime. If you have low income in the first few years after graduation, higher income in your 40s, and enter the top 10% of high-income earners just before retirement, you wouldn't consider society unfair. While examining data for an entire lifetime is challenging, studies have already been conducted. Research indicates that over half of American adults have entered the top 10% at some point in their lives, typically in the stage before retirement. Another study found that the majority, 95%, of individuals who were in the lowest fifth of income in 1975 had later moved out of that lowest group, and 29% of them entered the highest fifth of income in 1991. Yet another study found that those in the lowest fifth of income in 1996 had their income grow by 91% by 2005, while those initially in the top 1% had a decrease in income by 26% over the same period. So, what is the real situation? Young people have low income, but the lower your starting point, the greater the growth potential. With improved skills and experience, most people have the opportunity to enter the middle and high income groups later on. The income of the top 1% mainly depends on luck, and their luck won't always be good. So, the so-called income inequality in the United States does not divide people into two isolated classes of poor and rich. In reality, most people experience both low and high incomes. Yes, cross-sectional data shows that it's becoming easier for high-income earners to make money. Perhaps because technological progress makes knowledge increasingly valuable. However, this doesn't mean there is an absolute widening of income inequality among individuals, because you can also enter the high-income circle. Other countries may not have the same situation, but data suggests this is true in the United States, likely because it is a developed country that can provide a large number of high-income positions. Sowell is not the only one pointing out this cognitive error. We've previously discussed Nassim Taleb's Skin in the Game, which specifically talked about this issue. It's not an unsolved mystery. Another example is the famous claim of the Great Stagnation, stating that since the 1970s, the real income of American households has stopped growing. Many scholars, including Tyler Cowen, have said so, and I used to think it was true. However, Sowell argues that the claim of income growth stagnation is also a mistaken judgment. Yes, the growth of household income in the United States did stagnate. For example, between 1969 and 1996, household income only grew by 6%. But you need to consider that American families became smaller. The average number of people per family decreased. If you look at per capita income in the US, the conclusion is that during the same period, per capita real income grew by 51%. Comparing oneself, American poor people are not absolute poor people. As mentioned earlier, from 1975, 95% of those in the lowest fifth of income had moved to other groups by 1991. Comparing with other countries, American poor people are not absolute poor people. In 2001, 3/4 of the officially defined poor population in the U.S. had air conditioning, 97% had a color television, 73% had a microwave, and 98% had a VCR or DVD player. According to general standards, this is not poverty. So, the reality is that, although American society has many problems, it is not so unfair. The real problem for poor people in the United States is not economic but social. For example, living in unstable single-parent households, residing in violent neighborhoods, substance abuse, and lack of quality education in schools. These are unfair, but mainly not income-related. The government has numerous welfare programs, and anyone willing to work honestly can completely make ends meet. So, the reality is that, although American society has many problems, it is not so unfair. Why do intellectuals ignore these basic facts and insist on portraying society in such a dismal way? Perhaps it's because only injustice can provide emotional value. If you only provide emotional value, your opinion is not worthy of serious consideration. And it should not be taken seriously, or else it can be dangerous. Sowell does not criticize unknown entities. Earlier, we discussed his reversal of Rousseau's theory, and here we see how Sowell criticizes another prominent figure. Political philosopher John Rawls, 1921–2002. If you want to talk about social justice, you must read Rawls's 1971 book A Theory of Justice. Rawls invented an ingenious definition of justice. The best definition of what is fair in any given society. In any given society, due to different populations and inevitable class divisions, there are poor and rich people, each with their own demands. It's challenging to say what is fair in the end. The poor may argue that the government should tax the rich more and then provide us with welfare. The rich may argue that society should encourage work and creation, and welfare will reduce efficiency. Because everyone is subjective, acting in their self-interest, the so-called ass decides the head, no one can convince anyone else. Rawls's brilliant creation is a thought experiment called the veil of ignorance. How can we arrive at an objective, just society? Suppose everyone collectively designs a virtual game. First, we set the rules for this game. For example, how much welfare the poor should receive and how much tax the rich should pay. Then, we allocate roles to each person in the game. The future allocation of roles is random, and now everyone is hiding behind a veil of ignorance. You don't know if you will be poor or rich, an official or a freelancer. So, in this situation, how would you design the rules of the game? Of course, you would make the game as fair as possible because you don't know if you will be born poor or rich, so you would ensure that everyone's life is reasonably good. Rawls argues that only rules for society developed under this logic could possibly be genuinely fair. I greatly admire Rawls's setup. It's a Kantian moral reasoning, a socially just scenario derived from rational deduction. Indeed, only this can ensure objectivity. Based on this, Rawls deduced a series of policy recommendations, stating how society should be arranged. Sowell severely criticizes this. Sowell asks, who will arrange it? The real world is not a game, and there is no external programmer who can arbitrarily input settings. If there is to be any arrangement, it can only be done by the government. And this means that, to achieve the social justice Rawls desires, the people must surrender more power to the government. The expansion of government power is dangerous at all times, because the government will inevitably act recklessly, and individual freedom will be compromised. Trusting the visible hand to intervene, claiming that these people can make society better, is the consistent mindset of progressives. Economists have always been very vigilant about this tendency. Adam Smith had long called people with grand plans, wanting to systematically transform society, men of system. He believed that such people were prone to two errors. One is that your idea might be wrong. The real world is complex, and your theoretical model is simplified. You cannot guarantee that the set of rules you designed is genuinely good. The other mistake of men of the system is treating others in society as pawns to be manipulated at will. If you tell people to do something, must they do it? If you establish a set of rules, must others follow them? If someone exercises subjective initiative and decides that your rules are not good, and they don't want to play with you, what will you do? Sowell extends the thought of Adam Smith. He believes that scholars like Rawls study desirability, or what kind of social situation we want. Not feasibility, or whether that social situation is possible to achieve. Intellectuals do not have to take responsibility for their words and can casually say how society should be. Rawls's A Theory of Justice is just a wish list. But economists must study whether that wish is really possible to fulfill. And economists have accumulated too many lessons. If you step out of the imagined moral reasoning and take a look at the real world, you will find that almost all social reforms carried out under the banner of social justice have resulted in the opposite of their intended consequences. There are too many cases in economic history where intellectuals incited populist emotions, politicians gained power gains, and the common people ended up harming themselves by lifting stones to hit their own feet. We will discuss this in the next part.
If you feel there is value in this, please like, subscribe to this channel, and leave your thoughts or suggestions in the comments section. Let's grow together and read more good books.